The official letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, cut into my finger as I stood by the mailbox, but what hurt more were the words inside. After reviewing the community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. I read it over and over, my hands shaking. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. I walked straight to the home of Eleanor Winters, our new HOA president, with her perfect garden and even more perfect smile. She opened the door, dressed in her workout clothes, not even trying to hide her annoyance. "How can I help you, David? This letter says you're taking my land." "There must be some mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "There is no mistake. Our professional survey shows that your grandfather's hand-drawn map is incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night. Without telling me? I've been paying taxes on that property for 15 years, I said. She checked her manicured fingernails. HOA rules don't require notice for property modifications. We're planning on building a beautiful resort-style pool there. Everyone will benefit, even you. I was about to argue when music blasted from next door, the Morgan's yard. Eleanor's smile turned genuine. I have to go. Tyler and Samantha are having a welcoming neighbor party. You should come. It might help you adjust to the changes. On the way home, the music got louder. Through the fence, I could see my neighbors, Tyler and Samantha, and their friends laughing by the new pool, which had been built suspiciously close to our property line. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bass pounded until 1 a.m. I called Tyler twice, but no one answered. At 1:15, I knocked on their door. Tyler opened the door, red-faced and holding a beer. Hey man, the party's over. What's going on? It's almost 1:30. Some of us have to work tomorrow. Samantha appeared behind him. We stopped the music at 1. Checked the rules. The noise is fine. Tyler cut her off. Eleanor said we're allowed until 1. It's not our problem if you hear people talking. I took a deep breath. Speaking of Eleanor, did you know about this HOA plan for my back acre? Their guilty look said it all. You knew. You knew they were stealing my land. Not stealing, Samantha corrected, reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, a cocktail bar on my land. Tyler shrugged. Nothing personal. Eleanor showed us the actual property boundaries. Grandpa's map was inaccurate. Back home, I couldn't sleep. I dug up Grandpa's old wooden chest from the attic. Inside were the original property documents, yellowed with age. I spread them out on the kitchen table under the lamplight, comparing them to the modern survey Eleanor had included in her letter. Something was wrong. Grandpa's boundaries followed natural landmarks, creeks, old oaks, rocky ridges. The HOA map ignored these entirely, drawing straight lines that conveniently cut off my best acres. I noticed a small line in the corner of Grandpa's land title that I had never noticed before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. If those markers still existed, a plan began to form in my head. But I needed help. I scrolled through my phone book until I found James Jacobson, a surveyor who had worked on with my dad years ago. I texted him, even though it was 3 a.m. The next morning, I called in sick and drove to the county recorder's office. My cousin Vince worked there, and I needed access to the original surveys. These HOA people, Vince muttered as we rummaged through the dusty files, they get bolder every year. Here it is. The 1952 survey clearly showed that my property extended further than even I had thought. The creek had moved after a flood in the 70s, but the property lines hadn't moved with it. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Community notice. Groundbreaking for Pinecrest Resort begins Tuesday. Please remove all personal belongings from the designated area. Tuesday. That gave me 5 days. On the way home, I drove by Morgan's house. Workers were installing a larger speaker system by their pool. Tyler waved cheerfully to me as I passed. That afternoon, Jacobson arrived with his equipment. Find those stumps, he said. If they're still there, the HOA is going to be in big trouble. We worked until the sun went down, carefully staying out of sight behind my shed. Under years of overgrown weeds, Jacobson's metal detector found the first landmark. His eyebrows rose. According to this, your property extends 50 feet in that direction, including part of the Morgan's new pool. We found 3 more landmarks before dark. Each confirmed what my grandfather's map showed. My land was actually larger than I had maintained. There's more, Jacobson said quietly. See this ridge? The geological survey from the 50s noted it as a potential archaeological site. Native American artifacts were found here in the 40s. I remembered my grandfather's stories about arrowheads and pottery shards. I thought they were just tall tales. What does that mean legally? If confirmed, it could trigger a historic preservation review. No development allowed. That night, another party began next door. This time, I smiled as the music played. Let them enjoy it while they can. My doorbell rang around 8 p.m. Rose Thompson, my 80-year-old neighbor from across the street, was standing there with a casserole. Thought you might need some dinner with all the noise next door, she said. I invited her in and told her everything. Rose listened carefully and then said, Eleanor has been doing this for years. She evicted the Hendersons last summer on false charges. Their house is now her daughter's. Why didn't anyone stop her? Scared. She's a friend of the mayor's wife. But Rose's eyes sparkled. I taught high school history for 40 years and volunteered at the county museum. I know a thing or two about archaeological preservation. As Rose left, she paused at the door. This land means something to you, doesn't it? Beyond its property value. I thought of my grandfather teaching me to fish in the creek, my father building a treehouse in an old oak. That's my history. Then fight for it, she said simply. In bed that night, my phone lit up with a text message from an unknown number. Meeting tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eleanor S. Get contractors out to mark out the pool on your property. Don't tell David. They were going to text someone else. My heart was pounding. They weren't going to wait until Tuesday. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. I needed to be ready before they arrived. I woke up before dawn, gulping down coffee as I got ready. Jacobson arrived in an unmarked truck, his equipment hidden under a tarp. If we're right about those markers, he whispered as we worked in the dim light, the HOA survey missed almost 2 acres of your property. Dew dampened my jeans as we staked out the exact spot where my grandfather's easement indicated. With each stake, my confidence grew. The last marker passed right over the corner of Tyler and Samantha's new wood deck. They built that deck last month, I told Jacobson. Convenient timing. More than convenient, he replied, checking his GPS. According to the county's permit, they built it after the HOA's new survey. It's almost like they knew where the new boundary would be. He handed me his tablet, which showed the official report. The HOA survey had completely missed the creek's original path before the 1978 flood. No professional would make that mistake by accident. As the sun rose higher, we heard vehicles approaching. Hide the equipment, I whispered. Let's see what they do. From behind my garden shed, we saw Eleanor arrive with 3 other board members and a gardening crew. They unpacked spray paint and measuring tools, laughing as they marked out locations for cabanas, a tiki bar, and a large pool, all on my property. This spa feature would be perfect here, Eleanor said, marking a large X through my grandmother's rose garden, which I had maintained for 20 years. I wanted to confront them, but Jacobson held me back. Not yet. We need more. Later that morning, I visited the local history society, where my mother had volunteered. Director Maria greeted me warmly. Interesting timing, she said, pulling out a folder. Someone from the county just requested all your property records. Eleanor Winters? Maria nodded. She seemed very interested in whether any historical claims had been filed. I explained my situation. Maria's expression darkened. This happened in Meadowbrook. Their HOA president works for the same development company as Eleanor. She pulled out a newspaper article. They turned half the neighborhood into vacation rentals after forcing the original owners out. Now I understood. This wasn't just about a community pool. It was about property values and development deals. I need proof of archaeological significance. Grandpa always talked about it, I said. Maria smiled. Your grandfather actually donated some artifacts he found on your property. She brought out a small box containing arrowheads and pottery shards. They've been cataloged but not fully examined. I can arrange for an expert evaluation. When I got home, I found Rose in her garden across the street. They're marking my land right now, I told her. I know, she said calmly. I've been taking pictures every hour. She handed me her phone. Documentation is key. I called Vince back that afternoon. I need two things: an emergency historic preservation application and any information about Eleanor Winter's business connections. While I waited for Vince's call back, I noticed Tyler watching me from his yard. Hey, neighbor, he called out, too cheerfully. Excited about the new resort? I walked over to the fence. Why did you build the deck after the HOA survey but before the boundary change was announced? His smile wavered. The permit for your deck was filed the day after Eleanor's survey. What an interesting coincidence. Look, we're just following the official property lines, he stammered. The official lines include the 1952 markers I found this morning. One of them is right under your hot tub. Tyler's face paled. He mumbled something about needing to make a call and hurried inside. A few minutes later, my phone rang. David, it's Eleanor. Her voice was as sweet as honey. I heard you have concerns about the community project. Why don't you come by and we can discuss it? I want to talk to everyone present. How about a special HOA meeting? That's not necessary. This has already been decided. So my next step is the same, I replied. Are you threatening me? Her voice hardened. Just follow proper procedures, like recording the original boundary markers that your survey somehow overlooked. A pause. What markers? The ones from 1952. Jacobson found them this morning. I could almost hear her thinking. Those old ones. They don't relate to modern surveys. The county assessor's office disagrees. I just talked to them. Another pause. We'll discuss this tomorrow. In the meantime, stay off the common areas. You mean my property? I'll use it all. I hung up, feeling stronger than I had in weeks. Vince called back immediately. You touched a nerve, he said. Eleanor just requested emergency access to all of your property records. Too late for her. Too late. I've flagged your lot with a preliminary historic preservation assessment notice. Nothing can be developed while that's pending. That evening, I invited Rose and Jacobson over to plan our next steps. We spread out a map on my kitchen table. Headlights swept through the windows. There's someone here, Rose said, peering through the curtains. It's Eleanor and the Morgans. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with messages from the neighbors. Are you okay? Saw Eleanor coming to your house with the sheriff. Tyler, telling people you threatened him. Jacobson looked grave. They're escalating, trying to intimidate you. Let them try, I said, collecting our evidence into a folder. The doorbell rang, followed by an aggressive knock. I opened the door to find Eleanor, Tyler, Samantha, and a man in uniform. Good evening, everyone, I said calmly. What's got you here so late? Eleanor stepped forward. First, David, this is Deputy Wilson. We're concerned about your erratic behavior today. Tyler nodded vigorously. You threatened me in front of my family. I gasped. That's completely untrue. Deputy Wilson looked awkward. Sir, I understand there's a property dispute, but threatening a neighbor. I never threatened anyone, I interrupted. In fact, I have witnesses to our conversation. I pointed to Rose's house, where her security camera faced my yard. The deputy's expression changed. Is that so? Eleanor interrupted smoothly. This isn't just about today. We're concerned about David's mental state. He's making wild claims about property boundaries that were settled years ago. I laughed. Settled? You just resurveyed them last month. Samantha spoke up. He's been obsessed with the boundaries since we moved in. Always peeking at us, complaining about the noise. Because you built on my property and partied until 1 a.m., I countered. The deputy raised his hand. Okay, everyone calm down. This sounds like a civil matter, not criminal. Eleanor not give up. He's been digging up community land without permission, destroying the landscape. You mean my land? I opened the folder and handed the deputy a copy of Jacobson's survey report, the original land title, and a photo of the 1952 markers. These documents prove the HOA survey is incorrect. They're trying to take almost 2 acres of my rightful land. The deputy reviewed the papers while Eleanor huffed in silence. "Ma'am," he finally said, "this appears to be a legitimate property dispute that should be resolved through proper channels, not police intervention." "But," Eleanor began, "unless there's evidence of actual threats or trespass, I can't take action here." He handed the papers back to me. "I suggest both parties contact their attorneys." As they turned to leave, I called after Eleanor. "One more thing. You should tell your friends at Lakeside Development that the county has initiated a historic preservation assessment on my property, effective immediately." Eleanor froze, then turned. "How did you know about?" She trailed off, but it was too late. The deputy looked between us, clearly sensing something more. "Good evening, everyone," I said pleasantly, closing the door on Eleanor's shocked expression. Inside, Rose, Jacobson, and I exchanged triumphant glances, but we knew this was just the beginning. "They'll be back with lawyers," Jacobson warned. "Let them," I replied, tapping away at the folder. "We have the truth on our side." Rose smiled slightly. "And tomorrow. There'll be more tomorrow. I've arranged for an archaeologist friend to examine the artifacts Maria found." My phone buzzed with a text from Vince. "Connection found. Eleanor's husband is CFO at Lakeside Development. They just filed plans for vacation rentals in your neighborhood." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. This wasn't just about a resort pool. They wanted my land as part of a larger commercial development. "We need to warn the neighbors," I said. "Someone's already done that," Rose replied, handing me her phone, where a neighborhood chat group was exploding with messages about Eleanor's development connection. A final message came in from an unknown number. "An emergency HOA meeting is called for 7 a.m. tomorrow. All board members are requested." Jacobson laughed. "Looks like someone's panicking." I should have been relieved, but something was bothering me. They don't give up that easily. Eleanor's invested too much. As if summoned by my words, the lights in my backyard suddenly lit up. Huge construction lights were mounted on the Morgans' property, shining directly at my house. The light was blinding, flooding every window. "What's that?" Jacobson began. Rose peered through the glare. "There's someone out there, by your shed." Squinting against the light, I could just make out the silhouettes of people moving across my property. They were removing my boundary flags. The rumble of heavy machinery woke me at 4:30 a.m. I rushed to my window and spotted a giant yellow bulldozer making its way toward my back acre. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, my title, and my flashlight before running outside in my flip-flops. "Stop right there," I yelled, waving my flashlight frantically. The bulldozer's headlights blinded me as it continued forward, its metal blades glinting in the pre-dawn darkness. The operator, a distracted-looking man in a hard hat, finally turned off the engine. "Listen, man, I'm just following orders. There's paperwork here that says this is HOA property." "Then your paperwork's wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice even as my heart pounded. My grandfather's warnings about being careful with our property lines echoed in my head. Headlights swept across my yard as the 3 vehicles pulled up. Eleanor stepped out of her white Range Rover, dressed in a tailored suit despite the early morning, followed by the Morgans and 2 men I didn't recognize, carrying briefcases. "Mr. Jackson," Eleanor called, flashing a wry smile. "I see you're up early. Great. You can watch the groundbreaking." I held up my phone. "I've called Sheriff Davis. He's on his way." "You're trespassing on private property." "Actually," Eleanor replied, opening a document from her leather briefcase. "According to the county survey we commissioned, this property is within the community boundaries." "We're being generous with the compensation package." Tyler Morgan chuckled behind her. "Time to join the team, Jackson. The resort will increase all of our property values." I stood firm, feeling the damp grass between my toes. "I filed an emergency restraining order yesterday. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, and I have the original survey markers to prove it." Eleanor's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly. "A restraining order? How inconvenient." She turned to one of the men in suits. "Harold, call Judge Watkins. Wake him if necessary." The distant wail of a police siren cut through the tension. Sheriff Davis, my father's old fishing buddy, pulled up in his patrol car, looking uncomfortable. "What's going on?" he asked, adjusting his belt as he approached. Eleanor stepped forward with a hand outstretched. "Good morning, Sheriff." "A slight misunderstanding over the property line. There's nothing to worry about." "There's nothing to worry about," I repeated, my voice growing louder. "They're trying to steal my land." Sheriff Davis looked between us. "Ma'am, do you have a permit for this machinery to operate before 7 a.m. and a building permit for whatever you're planning?" Eleanor's smile wavered. "We have HOA authorization." "That's not what I asked," Sheriff Davis interrupted. "County ordinance says no construction before 7 a.m. in residential areas, and I don't see any permits on display." While they argued, I noticed Rose, my 78-year-old neighbor, walking toward us with a stack of yellowing paperwork. She had been on the original HOA board 30 years ago, before retiring. "Eleanor," Rose called, her voice stronger than her frail appearance. "You should see these before you make a mistake." "Terrible mistake." Eleanor waved her off. "Not now, Rose." Rose ignored her, handing me the papers. "Your grandfather and I prepared for something like this years ago. The HOA tried the same tactic in '89 with the Henderson property." I skimmed the documents, the original meeting minutes showing that the boundaries had indeed been officially recorded with the state, not just the county. "Sheriff," I said, "I want to file a harassment complaint, and I want these people and their equipment off my property immediately." Eleanor's phone vibrated. She stepped aside to answer it, her face darkening as she listened. When she returned, her voice had lost its edge. "It looks like there's been a paperwork conflict," she announced to her team. "We're going to postpone work today to sort out these technical issues." The bulldozer operator looked relieved as he climbed down from his machine. "No work today, then?" Eleanor snapped as they reluctantly retreated. I noticed a few neighbors had gathered at the edge of my property, watching the scene. Some had their phones out recording everything. Eleanor noticed too. Her eyes narrowed as she walked to her car. "This isn't over, Jackson. The council will vote tomorrow on invoking our emergency powers clause. I suggest you prepare a reasonable counteroffer before then." Sheriff Davis waited until they drove away before turning to me. "Your father always said the HOA would try something like this after he died. Are you okay?" I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of fighting this battle alone. "I'll be fine, but I need to prepare for tomorrow." Rose patted my hand. "You're not alone, kid. Some of us remember what this community was like, before people like Eleanor tried to turn it into their personal country club." As we stood in my yard watching the sunrise, my phone buzzed with a text from Jacobson. "Found something big in the county archives. Meet me at 9, bring coffee, lots of coffee." I looked up at my neighbors, still lingering at the edge of my property. Some waved encouragingly, while others awkwardly turned away. The battle lines were being drawn, and tomorrow's vote would test exactly who stood where. "You can't go in there," Eleanor's assistant tried to block my path as I pushed through the double doors of the Ridge Community Center. The HOA's emergency meeting had started 20 minutes early, another of Eleanor's tricks. "Actually, I can," I replied, clutching my briefcase. Inside were the results of my all-night research session with Jacobson, documents that would change everything. Heads turned as I walked down the center aisle. The room was packed with more than 100 neighbors, some I'd known for decades, others who had arrived recently, lured by Eleanor's promises of an upgraded resort-style community. Eleanor stood at the podium, mid-sentence, her bright red lipstick matching her blazer. As I said before I was interrupted, a vote to invoke our Community Enhancement Clause requires a 2/3 majority. "Before anyone votes," I announced loudly, "you should know what you're actually voting for." Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers tightened on the microphone. "Mr. Jackson, you're out of order. We're following the Robert Rule here." "It's funny you mention rules," I said, opening my briefcase, "because I spent all night discovering how many rules you've broken." Murmurs spread through the crowd. I spotted the Morgans in the front row, Tyler nervously adjusting his collar. Rose stepped back. Rose gave me an encouraging nod. "Order requested," Harold, Eleanor's lawyer friend, called. "The agenda doesn't allow for that." "The agenda was changed without proper notice," I countered. Item 5 of your bylaws requires 72 hours notice for emergency meetings. No changes allowed after distribution. Harold's mouth closed as several neighbors murmured their agreement. I moved to the front table where the council was sitting. I request 10 minutes to present relevant information before any vote takes place. Council member Diana Chun, always fair despite her friendship with Eleanor, spoke up. I propose we allow Mr. Jackson to speak. Okay, several voices called. Eleanor's face tensed, but she stepped aside. Very well. 10 minutes. I spread 3 large maps out on the presentation table. This first document is the original 1952 survey of Maple Ridge, showing the natural creek boundary that defined my family's property. I pointed to the winding blue line. The creek forms a natural boundary between private and public land. But in the flood of '78, the creek moved. Ancient history, Eleanor interrupted. Our recent survey. Your survey, I continued calmly, conveniently ignores the original boundary markers, which state law maintains as legal definitions even when natural features change. I announced Jacobson's new certified survey, with red boundary lines extending far beyond what the HOA claimed. According to state law and county records, my property includes this entire area, which unfortunately for some of you, includes the land you think is yours. There was a gasp as the neighbors realized the implications. That can't be, Tyler Morgan stammered, his face ashen. Unfortunately, it can be, I replied. Your pool extends 12 feet into my legal property, and Eleanor's home extension from last spring is 18 feet into the boundary line. All eyes turned to Eleanor, whose placid demeanor was broken for the first time. This is absurd. Our survey was done by your brother-in-law's company. I completed it for her, I said, a clear conflict of interest that I outlined in my complaint.